All right. Well, we're going to jump in because we got a lot to cover. I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm trying to cover a whole book of Esther tonight. Esther. So if you want to open up, it comes right after Nehemiah. We're trying to cover the whole book of Esther tonight. It's an amazing book. I encourage all of you to go read the book. But I'm going to apologize in advance. You better put your spiritual seatbelt on because I'm going to be moving. And the reason why I got to cover all of it is because you're going to forget all of it by next week. And if I do part 2, you're going to be like, what did we talk about last week? So get on your spiritual muscles, spiritual seatbelt, and get ready to rock and roll. So we're in the book of Esther. If you have a Bible app, go ahead, open it up. We're going to have some verses up here that you can follow along. All right? You guys ready? All right, let me pray. Pray with me. Father in heaven, we give you the glory because all the glory is already yours and belongs to you. We confess to you that we love ourselves and the things of this world more than you, that our hearts are a factory of idolatry and sin and immorality, and sometimes we just can't shut it off. We need a greater power to overcome the sin and idolatry in our hearts, so we cry out to you tonight, God, fill us with your presence. Heal us with your mercy and grace. Set us free tonight. Father, all these students that are here are not here by accident, so I pray for your glory that you would save tonight. Save students tonight. Call them out of darkness, out of an ordinary life, into your life, into eternal life tonight. Father, for those that are saying yes to you and pursuing you, let tonight's message speak to them and everyone this truth. You are always, always at work. You are always at work. May that one truth just even now begin to soften our hearts towards you. We ask Jesus in your name, and everyone said, Amen. All right, let's dive in. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson, okay? The reason why I got to give you a history lesson is because Esther is a historical book. The Bible is a historical book. And we can't understand how Esther is a hero if we don't understand a little bit of history. So pay attention here because it's pretty amazing. Follow with me, track with me. So here's the background, all right? The Persian Empire, way back in history, stretched from modern-day Libya, which was in Africa, to Pakistan, which was in Asia. It roughly stretched 3,000 miles. It was the largest human army known to date. 3,000 miles of an army of the Persian Empire back in history, okay? In 486, a long, long time ago, a king named Xerxes rose to power, and he had one desire. I want to overthrow Greece. I want to destroy Greece. So he set out to do that. In 481, he took 250,000 warriors in what is now modern-day Turkey, and he crossed into Greece. However, his plans to overthrow Greece didn't go as planned. Check this out. In 480, there was an incredible battle called Thermopylae. At this battle, a small force of Greek soldiers held off the entire Persian army for several days. For several days, a small force of Greek soldiers. The Persians figured out how to flank the Greeks. So they retreated. As they were retreating, a small band of incredible warriors of 300 stood at this small, narrow pass to keep the Persians from advancing. This small band of warriors of 300 stood at this place called Thermopylae and held off over 250,000 warriors. This battle is so famous that a movie came out called 300. Have you seen it? Have you heard of it? This battle is so popular that they made movies. There's all sorts of literature out there. But a month later, Xerxes decides, I got to try again. So he gets all of his warships, and they try to pass through a canal called Salamis. The Persian army took their warships into this canal. However, due to the size of their ships and the volume, they all got discombobulated. They got turned sideways. It was a traffic jam. It was like driving on Woodman at 8 in the morning or 7:30. It was a traffic jam. But it was perfect because the Greeks were able to destroy and sink all of the Persian ships in that canal. The Greeks continue to overcome the Persians. Though these victories and others, the Athenians were able to push the power toward Greece, shaping history. And it wasn't until Alexander the Great, 150 years later, that the Persian Empire was once and for all defeated. What does this have to do with our story? Check this out. The emperor, who the Greeks called Xerxes, was known in Persia as Kesartia, and in Hebrew as Ashashtarosh. All right? However, our English Bibles transliterate this name as Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus is the very king in the book of Esther. This King Xerxes is the very king that Esther is going to face in the entire book of Esther. This king, Ahasuerus, was the ruler of the most powerful empire in the world, and nothing was out of his disposal. So this is the king that Esther is going to face, the most powerful, destructive king and empire known to human history at this date. And this picks us up in chapter 1. Are you following me, the context? This is a big, powerful king and a big empire. So we open up here in Esther chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. It says this, 1 through 6. Now in the days of Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. So this dude reigned all over the place. Check this out. There are white cotton curtains and a violet hanging fastening with cords of linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars and couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. So in other words, what Xerxes has done is he says, I'm so powerful, I'm going to throw a party. And I want all the kingdoms to see how powerful I am. And so he's throwing this party, and it lasts a long time. And on the seventh day, he does something crazy. He tells his wife, Vashti, to come to the party. In verse 19, it says this, if it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another woman who is better than she. So here's what happens. Xerxes is showing off. And he has hundreds of wives. But there's one queen, and it's Vashti. And he says, Vashti, come on up. Let me show you off to all these kingdoms. Vashti says no. And at that moment, the king's rage, temper was on display, and he wrote an edict to all of his 30,000-mile nation and said, Vashti's no longer a queen. Why? Because she simply disobeyed him. She simply said no. She was probably upset. Maybe she was like, I'm not going to go out there and be put on display and embarrass myself. Who knows why, but she said no. And so here's what I want you to understand here. This is a bad king. You make him mad, boom, you're done. You make him mad, you're not a queen anymore. So then what happens is this. The king says this, find me a new wife. So we get into chapter 2, and the king is doing a modern-day bachelorette search. He's doing a modern-day bachelorette search. But it also introduces us to two main characters. Esther, who was an orphan because her parents died, and her cousin, Mordecai. He was 15 years older than Esther. And the whole point right now begins to unfold the story. Esther comes onto the scene. And basically what happens is the king says, out of 250,000 women, bring them all to me. I'm going to choose one. I'm going to choose one. A church historian said that the king brought 400 women out of the 250 million to his palace. So here's the king. Out of 250 million, he brings 400. And out of that 400 rises one woman named Esther. Esther gets chosen by the king. He's like, yes, that's my new bride. That's the one I want to marry. And you see that in verse 17 in chapter 2. It says this, the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So here's the thing. Esther's now on the scene. God is doing something, but what is God doing? What is God up to? We're about ready to find out. So as this royal bachelorette party search is happening, her cousin Mordecai's chilling in the palace. And Mordecai hears something. He hears a sinister plot of two of the guards to kill King Ahasuerus. Mordecai's just in the shadows. He's at the right place at the right time, but he hears the guards talking. Hey, we need to kill this king. Why? Maybe because they knew Vashti, and they're like, you mistreated Vashti, we're going to take you out. You did her wrong. And so we get here in chapter 2, it says this, in verse 20, Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigtham and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So right here at this moment, the plot thickens, setting up this whole story. Mordecai's there. Esther is a Jew. Mordecai says, don't let the king know you're a Jew. Keep it quiet. She doesn't let him know. She's now queen. But Mordecai found something out. And what Mordecai found out is that there's an even worse plot happening. In chapter 3, stick with me, there's this dude called Haman. In verse 1 through 6, it says this, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of a big word, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were with him at the gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were with the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you do this? Why don't you just bow down? And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai. So as they made known to him the people, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews. So here's what's happening. The plot's thickening. Follow me, students. Okay? Esther's queen. Mordecai's chilling. Mordecai hears that there's a plot to kill the king. As he reports that to the king kills those two guys and elevates a new leader over his army called Haman. Haman rolls out. I'm the new big dog. Sees Mordecai. Everyone's bowing down. Mordecai's not bowing down. Haman instantly decides to kill all the Jews. Well, what's Esther? A Jew. What's Mordecai? A Jew. So now Haman is filled with rage. Essentially, this is genocide. This is genocide. Modern day not modern day, but historical modern day genocide. Wipe all the Jews off the face of the earth. Why? Because Haman didn't like him. Why? Because Mordecai didn't bow down. Well, what do we need to know here? Check this out. This is amazing. Here's some history here. Haman had a deep hatred for the Jews. And here's why. It went back 1,000 years before in the book of Exodus when the Israelites attacked the Amalekites, who were descendants of Esau. 4 centuries later, King Saul, you guys know that name? King Saul went and conquered the Amalekites. God told Saul to kill all the Amalekites, including the king Agag. Saul defeated everyone, but he didn't kill the king. The prophet Samuel rolls up, and he's like, why didn't you kill the king? The prophet Samuel takes a sword and kills King Agag. Haman is a descendant of King Agag. He is furious because he knows the Jews killed his ancestry. Are you following me? He knows it was the Jews, it was the prophet that killed his descendant, and he's had a bitterness ever since. He's hated the Jewish people ever since they killed his king, his descendant, Agag. Well, what about Haman? Haman was a descendant. No, not Agag. Mordecai. Mordecai was a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin. And he was a Jew. So here's the tension, right? You have this at school, right? First day at school, someone walks, bumps you in the shoulder, and that type of relationship can last all through high school. You remember, man, you were a freshman, he or she said this or did that, and now you got bad blood, and it's freshman year, sophomore year, junior year, senior year, and it's just going to explode at some point. This is what's happening here. Mordecai knew, Haman knew, Haman hated the Jews, Mordecai knew Haman hated him, and it was building. And Haman thought, now's the time to get vengeance on my people. I'm going to kill all the Jews. Are you following me? It's important to understand this because there's a lot of things happening here outside of human control. There's a lot of relationships, a lot of variables here, and it looks like it's about to explode. And here is when Esther comes on the stage. Esther 3, verse 8. Listen to this. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not the king's profit to tolerate them. Check it out. If it pleases the king, make a decree to destroy all of them. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may be put into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, and basically said, go destroy all the Jews. Haman is conniving. He just went to the king and put a lie in the king's mind. There's these people called the Jews, and they want to overthrow you. They're useless. You ever get lied about? Hey, so-and-so wants to fight you. Hey, so-and-so doesn't like you. Hey, so-and-so thinks you're this. Hey, so-and-so thinks you're that. You ever been there? Yeah, you've been there. Other people gossiping about you, making lies about you. It ruins you. It ruins you. It's awful. The same thing is happening here. Haman's going to the king and making a lie so Haman can end up killing all the Jews. So here's what happens. In Esther chapter 4, Mordecai learned all that Haman was doing. And he goes to Esther in verse 8. And listen to this. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is a law, and that law is that they need to be put to death. Here's the thing. Esther is now in a tough spot. Mordecai goes to Esther and says, listen, you need to go to the king. You need to go to the king, and you need to let him know that our people are about ready to get slaughtered. Esther says, Mordecai, I can't just roll up into the king, because if the king doesn't invite me, he's going to kill me. So what you need to know, students, is this. In Persia, at that time, nobody just rolled up to the king. You could only see the king if you had an invitation from the king. And if anybody showed up in front of the king and the king did not extend his scepter, then that person was killed on the spot. So in order for Esther to do what Mordecai was requesting, Esther was breaking normal protocol and she was putting her life on the line. Students, do you get this tension here? Stay with me here. There's so much happening. Mordecai's going to Esther. You need to do this. How many times have you been asked, you got to do something for God. You got to do something bigger than yourself. And you're like, me? I can't do that. I don't want to do that. I don't want to get in that mess. I don't want to tell them to knock it off. I don't want to tell them stop treating people that way. I don't want to do that. I want to stay out of it. Mordecai's telling Esther, go to the king. And Esther's like, it's a death sentence. He's going to kill me. But listen to Mordecai's response to Esther's hesitation. Verse 14 in chapter 4. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Check this out, students, right here, listen. This is the key to everything. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Verse 16, Esther says, okay, go gather all the Jews and start fasting and praying for me. Esther is in. Mordecai says this to Esther. You may be the one that God has put in this place at this time to do this very thing that's impossible. Esther says, okay, I'm doing it. Gather all the Jews and start praying. Start fasting. Students, you have been put in time for such a time as this. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But we got to keep going. So what does Esther do? Here's Esther's action steps of heroism. Esther sets up a banquet. In chapter 4, 16 to 17, she sets up a banquet. She says, okay, I'm in. How am I going to do this? I got to go to the king. She goes to the king. It's incredible. She goes to the king, and it actually says the king says, Esther, most beautiful one, what do you want? What do you want? You just ask, I'll give you all the kingdoms. She found favor. He extended the scepter. She was safe. And she says, oh, king, if I found favor in your sight, join me for a banquet. You, me, and Haman. King says, no problem. God showed up and answered that prayer. Right then and there. The king says, I love you, you're beautiful, whatever you want. She found favor. That was the first thing. And we see that in verses 1 through 4 in chapter 5. It says this, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's place, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room, opposite of the entrance. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out the golden scepter that was in his hand. Esther approached him and says, what is it, Queen Esther? What's your request? It shall be given to you. And Esther says, if it pleases the king, let the king come today to a feast. Ma'am, she got herself ready. She looked all beautiful. She's prayed up. She's fasted up. She's got her whole army of Jews praying for her because there's power in prayer. And she puts her life on the line and approaches the king. And the king so much as just says, what's up, baby? What you need? whew, I'm alive. So we're not done though. She approaches the queen, and here's what's amazing. She approaches the queen, and sandwiched in the middle of all this is this incredible scene. All right? Haman leaves. Haman leaves, and he thinks he's about ready to get praised. He goes home, and he's like, man, there's a banquet tonight, and it's all for me. I'm going to get praised. I'm going to get celebrated. He tells his family, they're high-fiving. He's out, I'm getting promoted. Oh, it's going to be amazing. Well, here's what's happening outside of everybody's control. In chapter 6, the king can't sleep. In chapter 6, check this out. We can't read all of it for time's sake. The king can't sleep. The king says to his servants, hey, go grab the books. The books were basically decrees of records of, it'd be like reading the newspaper for most of you, boring. He's like, just read me something. It'd be like, put white noise on so I can fall asleep. Well, the king can't sleep, but check this out. What do they read? Never going to believe it. They read the story of a guy named Mordecai, who told about a guy named Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. In the course of reading, the king hears this name called Mordecai. And he says, time out. Mordecai is the one who saved my life? Yes, sir. Was anything done for Mordecai? No, sir. Was he praised? No, sir. It was popular in Persian times for the king to see something good and reward good behavior because it deterred rebellion. And the king's sleeping. He had no idea he couldn't sleep. Out of all the million stories, they read Mordecai. Coincidence? No. Mordecai is now on the king's mind. Check this out. The king calls Haman in and basically says, hey, Haman, what should be done for the guy that saves my life? Haman thinks he's talking about him. So Haman's like, dude, give him a Ferrari, give him a horse, give him all the riches, put your royal robe on him, put your ring on him, parade him all through the town, make a big deal. And the king says, great idea. Haman's like, here it comes. Go do that for Mordecai. Can you imagine your greatest enemy, the person you hate the most? And the king just said, go do exactly what you said to him or her? Dude, how great is God? So then Mordecai goes home and just loses it. He's like, that's supposed to be me. Well, it gets even better. Esther comes back and says, come to another banquet. So in chapter 7, check this out in verse 3. Then the queen Esther answered, so they're at the banquet. The king says again, hey girl, what you need? Ask. Now's her time. We got King Xerxes, Ahasuerus. We've got Esther and Haman all in the same room. His arch enemy Mordecai, he knows he's got to celebrate. Haman is fuming. Haman's like, what is happening? All my scheming and all my plotting and all my conniving is not working. Esther says this in verse 3. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish and my people for my request. Check it out. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we have been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then the king answered, who is he, and where is he? Who dares to kill all of you? Esther says, a foe, an enemy, points right at Haman and says, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified. The king rose and from drinking wine, went to the garden, and Haman approached Esther and falls on her on the couch, please don't kill me. Please don't kill me. The king walks in and says, first you want to kill the Jews and now you want to take advantage of my wife? How dare you? And now Haman is killed. Haman prepared a place for Mordecai to be hung. Who is the one that ended up on that? Haman. Students, when you see this, this is the conclusion. Esther saved all of the Jews because she stepped out in faith and trusted God. Band, if you want to come up. Esther said, yes, I'm going to risk my life. But here's the conclusion. The book of Esther is compared to like a chess match between Satan and God, moving in real life kings and queens and nobles. And the hero of this story is God. Let me recap real quick. Out of 25 million women in the Persian Empire, God raised up a female orphan named Esther. Who did that? God. 2, Mordecai's exact place and time in the royal court to hear a plot to assassinate the king. Was that an accident or was that God? King Ahasuerus can't sleep. And the story that gets read to him is about Mordecai saving his life, which absolutely saved the Jews. Is that a coincidence or God? Haman's plot to kill Mordecai and have him hanged, only to be the place where he himself was hanged. Is that coincidence or is that God? That's God. Students, here's what I want you to understand. God is always working in your story. If you listen to this message tonight, that God is not mentioned one time. God is not mentioned one time. But God is working in every detail in this story. He's working in the king's heart. He's working in Mordecai. He's working in evil people. So students, in your life, God is at work. The parents who are fighting, God is there at work. The school situation, God is there at work. But here's the question for you tonight. But here's what I want you to know. God has raised you up for such a time as this. Students, God is raising you up to be an Esther, to stand tall, to be courageous, to be bold, to share the gospel, to be pure, to be different, and to stand before kings and armies to do what's right. God is raising you up for such a time as this. There's no adversity that's bigger than God. There's no person, no bully, no situation that's bigger than God. God is working everything together in the right time. You got to wait for him. Who's going to stand up? Who's going to be an Esther and say, God is going to raise me up for such a time as this? I want to raise up for such a time as this. I want to glorify him. I want to honor him. I want to serve him. I want to stand before a king, even if it costs me my life. I'm going to go to my peer groups and say, follow Jesus, even if I get called a Jesus freak or nerd. I want to be the one that gets raised up and see a revival of youth in this generation for the glory of Jesus Christ. I want to be stood up, and I want to do that. Students, but God is saying, I'm raising you up. I'm raising you up. I want all of you to be raised up and be an Esther in this generation. Are you going to answer that? Are you going to say yes? For such a time as this. So let's stand, let's sing, and let's say, God, raise me up for your glory.